Well, welcome everybody. I'm Brian O'Leary, Executive Director of the Book Industry Study Group, and we want to welcome you today to the State of Book Distribution, or an overview of consolidation, change, and opportunity in this part of our business. It's part of our Lunch and Learn series that we've been holding over the last 3.5 years. Our presenters today are Miriam Warren, who's Senior Director at the Fisher Company. Miriam's a member of our supply chain and book publishing next work committees and working group, and Richard T. Williams, who's a publishing consultant and content distribution expert who's worked in distribution for more than 2 decades and brings a day-to-day perspective that I think will be helpful in kind of understanding the current market. We're going to start with a presentation from Miriam, and it probably will raise some questions that you want to ask. If you have anything that you want to either add or put in the queue for the Q&A that will follow, we'll probably reserve most of this webinar, probably 40 minutes for conversation. Just put it in the chat and we'll take a look at it. Miriam, welcome. Thanks for preparing for this, and we're looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you, Brian. Go into the next slide. So again, thank you everyone for joining us today and for BISG for hosting Richard and myself. So we're looking forward to having a fairly quick presentation today. We're going to be focusing really on the US market, kind of recent history, just the last couple of years. We're not going to go all the way back to COVID. We are primarily talking about full service distribution companies, but we're also going to be talking about other options and alternatives that are available in this market, both currently and what we see kind of coming down the pipeline. So we're not going to go into detail about impacts of tariffs in the last couple of years, impacts of war, restricted areas, etc. We've had a lot of other presentations on that. And so today we're just going to be a little bit more focused. And so again, we're talking about the US primarily, and we're not covering international today. Next slide. Richard, you want to go ahead and cover these, please?
Yeah, sure. I'll take it. Thank you. Thanks everybody for being here. Well, I'll start just by saying that even though there's been no definitive sort of documented single reason for all of the closure and consolidation, here's what I think some of the biggest factors have been. Obviously, I think major publishing houses have stepped up. In particular, the KKR acquisition of Simon and Schuster and their initiative to expand business in all directions has meant that publishers originally too small to be on their radar have had lucrative opportunities. PRH and Macmillan have both continued to offer publisher services. Hachette has made significant movement into the ring recently, backing the Stable Book Group, which is a new sort of publisher association. And distribution for these houses is primarily a way to improve costs for existing infrastructure, but we've seen huge successes with numerous publishers through that pipeline. Amazon recalibrated after the pandemic. We all know this. We've talked about it to death. A few years back, when they were preparing to open more warehouses, they stuffed their pipeline. They reversed course. They sent a bunch of inventory back. Then they followed with a change in the forecasting and demand algorithm that would bring in narrower amounts of inventory going forward. That made a huge impact. Barnes & Noble has recalibrated overall after James Daunt bought the company. There have been a lot of new stores opening, but there's been a change in returns policy that has meant fewer returns, but also less inventory going in. And there have been fewer gambles in purchases. And overall, industry services have continued to rise, to cost more. Without naming names, I can think of maybe half a dozen services that distributors often provide to publishers that have raised their prices near catastrophically, and that, with the narrow margin middle person status of a distributor, they have to eat those costs, and it impacts them. So we've seen a lot of closures recently. I think the first big one was Small Press Distribution in California in 2024. They handled a lot of small and moderate sized literary presses. Some of that some of that business has gone to other distributors. I know IPG signed a few. Asterism brought on several. Consortium, who's a division of Ingram. Then Diamond Comic Distribution has also gone out of business. Their gaming went to their Alliance spinoff, and I think Lunar Distribution brought on a number of additional clients to kind of take on some of that graphic novel and comic business. And then, of course, the kind of heartbreaking one, Baker and Taylor, who were a cornerstone of the industry for I think 200 years. They went out of business in 2025. Their Baker and Taylor Publishing Services spinoff was purchased by Lakeside, and Lakeside has taken their print sort of legacy and their publishing legacy and their distribution piece to become a major new player. And the National Book Network, they went out of business in 2024. A lot of their business was funneled directly into Simon and Schuster. So that's a lot in terms of consolidation and change. Do you want me to talk about some other changes in the industry that have impacted this, or Miriam, do you want to take that next?
No, so I think one of the other things that that we wanted to just mention today is that we haven't been changing our retail prices, and that is one of the other areas where obviously if costs are going up, margins are getting thinner. So in our industry, the distributors are they have some of the smallest margins in the entire industry, so it's incredibly difficult for them to be successful. I'm going to the next slide. Excuse me. So this is just a list of some of our current options. We want to make it clear that this is not an exhaustive list. So we also invite anybody who has additional options and vendors to add those to the chat. We're not trying to exclude anybody, and we're actually one of the things that I found with the changes in generative AI is that a lot of these distributors do not have websites that are being found during generative AI searches. So not only are we they're not marketing heavily as far as making people know about their services, but now they're going to be even more difficult to find just through a search. So again, this is not an exhaustive list. Please go ahead and add to this. So again, these are just a few examples. APG's out of Nashville. They serve a lot of religious publishers. Asterism has a lot of smaller literary presses. Books International works with academic and some trade. Casemate also does some academic. CDC does a lot of work with academic. Again, these are kind of major areas, not full spectrum here. Hachette works with the trade, Ingram trade, etc. Ingram also the trade. IPG works with a variety of groups, so trade, academic, and they've also taken a lot of the comic book publishers after Diamond. Lakeside obviously has taken over Baker and Taylor, so they're a huge company. They're growing. Simon and Schuster took on a lot of the MBN clients, as Richard mentioned, and again, mainly for the trade. So again, there are others. So we just happy to talk about those. But 5 years ago, this list would have been much longer. And so really what's happening is that companies, the distributors are taking on more and more clients that may not even be as appropriate for them. But everybody's kind of in a pinch to find partners for distribution. So it's just getting really tough out there. So when you're looking for a new distributor, Richard can talk a little bit more about this later, but you really want to look at all of your distribution options. So today we're talking about just full service distribution for most of our vendors, but there are other options. There are publishers who provide distributions. There are fulfillment options where you can have your own sales reps or in-house sales. Your printers might actually provide fulfillment. It's worth checking with them. So again, we're not going to go into all of the different models here. IBPA is actually working on a different, like an updated distribution resource center that will go into all of these models. That'll be announced pretty soon. So again, we don't want to duplicate that here. But when you're going into this, make sure you look at all of your options, um, look at the terms, but really understand timing, metadata requirements, and what it's going to take to move your stock over. And if you are moving your stock, you have to expect essentially a 6-month disruption to your sales, as far as just getting everybody aware of what's happening and getting the inventory physically moved, and getting point of contact switched over along with data. Richard, is there anything else that you wanted to add to that?
No, not specifically. I think that the questions come up in a minute. We can address some of them. But I can go ahead and talk about some of the opportunities here. Um, So collaboration, I think that the key here when you're looking for a partnership is that you want a team that you can collaborate with, and that exists in many other ways. So my main perspective is unique because for 2 decades I've been a publisher advocate under a distribution umbrella, which means that, I'm the one that takes the publisher needs back to the distributor's team and be like, hey, like they need this, and try to negotiate that. And I think that any good publisher distribution relationship is a negotiation and is a regular one. And what that means is that as you're collaborating, you need to have people that you can talk to. I used to hold monthly meetings on a regular basis with most of my clients, just put something on the calendar. If they didn't need to meet, we didn't meet, but at least it was there. That gave both sides an opportunity to talk about, what the publisher's role is and what the distributor's role is in any business venture. So I'll go through some of your tips here first. In terms of dedicated reps on each side, I do think that most publishers should have a team that is dedicated to working with their distributor, and specifically that because there are so many other revenue streams that a publisher has. Trade distribution isn't all of it, and you should have some specialists who kind of know the ins and outs of the distributor business. And also, the distribution company should have dedicated reps for you, specifically for your publishing program, in addition to other clients. Like I said, I had a roster of clients that I met with on a regular basis. Um, and that could handle, those meetings could handle, future business conversations about where the publishing program was going to go, changes in the publishing industry, changes to the distributor services, changes in costs and reporting and metadata operations and all sorts of things. So, all of these things are crucial communication points. But again, collaboration isn't just communication. And I think that one thing I can say, and I'll kind of break into this now, is that after years and years and years, I kind of have a sense of what publishers want from a distribution program. And to be clear, I would say that the median size of publisher that I've worked with historically has been, the publishers who do about 1 million annually, much smaller, much larger than that as well. So that's where my perspective comes from. And publishers want these things, and they're not always things that are going to be negotiated in a distribution deal. So I think that they should be thought about in advance. Cultural impact. I can't emphasize this one enough because this one kind of gets pushed under the table. Most publishers, especially when independent, are striving to make a mark or get a message across. Some specialize in particular niches, and others believe they are bringing unheard voices to the fore. As distribution continues to be economically marginalized by all these other things that we've mentioned, companies can move into a pure business mindset and may not have a stake in that publisher sort of motivation. So I would say I recommend sympathetic partnership, and that should be discussed during the negotiation process. Community is another one. Similarly, I think publishers want to be part of a list with other publishers and books and authors that enhance their own community. I definitely recommend evaluating, for any publisher, evaluate the roster of the distribution house that you're talking to make sure it's a good fit. And also remember that from a distributor's perspective, they may be looking for something that they don't already have, and that can be beneficial to both sides. The next one is attention. I guess that sounds a little reductive, but We are seeing this massive changes due to AI implementation, which, hey, Miriam, we just mentioned AI for the first time now, right? And basically, I think that automated processes are taking the place of some of the handholding in numerous situations. And while that can be financially beneficial, it means that you lose some of that continued personalization that sort of doubles down on the attention that the publisher is receiving. Um, Advice, most publishers I've worked with over the years desperately want to improve because nobody wants to be cut from their distribution roster because their products aren't selling. Um, I would often help publishers review their acquisitions pipeline in order to know what's going to work for a trade distributor, what has the most market appeal, what could lead to future successes, and of course reviews of title and pricing and packaging and things for the market. I think that's just crucial. So look for a partner that can do that. Um, Availability, I would say first and foremost, distribution is about supply chain. And if the book is not visible while the marketing is happening, that obviously is not a good partnership. And that's tricky because a good distributor is going to want to know that your titles are well marketed, and yet it is the marketing that is basically going to, kind of drive a lot. So I think that, you just have to get that balance right and talk to your distributor there. There have been examples, I know I'm talking very fast, but there have been examples where I've worked with a publisher for months, even years, and before they realized that we weren't doing consumer marketing for them. So I think that these things just need to be discussed, kind of going into the relationship. Um, Feedback. Sales happen, but most publishers only see sales successes. I think one of the things that I constantly got the message about was we want to know what's happening in terms of sales progress. Um, it's one thing to get placement at a Barnes and Noble, and it's another thing if you don't even know whether the book is being presented there. So I understand that commercial buyers don't have time to give feedback on every sales presentation, but most distributors should be able to tell a publisher when a book is presented and why, in their opinion, it may or may not get a good buy. Um, Options and opportunities. I think this is just about communication again and making sure that if something isn't working, there is an opportunity to talk through it, talk about what changes could happen, talk about what directions a distributor could change to add a feature to their reporting, or a publisher might specifically just say, hey, that's not working for our distributor, so we're not going to do that line of books anymore. And then the biggest one, obviously, is affordability. Distribution is in essence about leveraging prices across a volume. And if it costs the publisher the same amount to do something that it does the distributor, then you kind of have to wonder if the model needs to be better evaluated. So ask those difficult financial questions in the negotiation process as well. So I guess I'll leave it on identity. Whether the distributor has a visible brand or the publisher has a visible brand, identity in the marketplace is crucial. And some publishers love being part of a larger group that sort of consumes their identity, and others want to be the voice. So I think you need to negotiate what that's going to be before you enter into any relationship. All right, I'm done. Next slide.
Sure. So thank you, Richard. So I think some of the things that we see that are going to be really critical coming up, we need better metadata just across our industry. There's a lot of opportunity for reporting out that already exists. Um, excuse me. So we are working on best practices actually as far as reporting stock availability between the publisher and result to the retailers so that the consumer can get the book, obviously. So again, there are some areas in our Onyx feeds and EDI, et cetera, that do exist that we're going to be identifying as best practices uh, to our publishers. Other opportunities we talked about publishers who offer distribution. There are also printers who are offering fulfillment, and other vendors that are offering some other services. Again, there's so many different opportunities and variations on the model that are worth looking into. Just be aware. There also, as Richard mentioned, one of them being the stable. There's some publishing consortiums and co-ops coming together that that are once you're in, there are some huge volume discounts available. So so there are a few different opportunities there. The other piece that, again, I'm just talking about this from an operational point of view, not a pro or con against Amazon, just kind of state of the industry. So, previously libraries had struggled ordering directly from Amazon. Amazon saw the opportunity when Baker and Taylor went down and have now made it much easier for libraries to order directly from Amazon, which again, pros and cons to both sides. Um, Amazon has now opened up its supply chain to pretty much anyone. This has not been that widely announced in the industry, even though it is in a lot of other business articles. And actually, as just as an individual Amazon user, I have now been pitched Amazon supply chain services. I think I got an email last week. Richard, I think it was literally the day after we were discussing the slideshow, that I got an email from Amazon saying if you're a sole proprietor, or if you work for a small company that may need business, supply chain services, please apply. So it is out there, and I think it's going to attract a lot of small publishers that are limited in their current options based on potentially revenue size, also the geography of where they may be. So again, we have to look at what we as an industry are not currently providing and what we can do better. But we just need to also be aware of the reality that Amazon is offering these services, and I'm sure we're going to see some publishers going over there. So, kind of a watch this space memo here. So, so again, I think there are a lot of opportunities here. Um, Richard, did you have anything else to add here?
I mean, in terms of opportunities, I think you mentioned a lot of printers are expanding and offering distribution options, and I think that somebody in the chat had mentioned, 3PLs, and I think that there are a lot of 3PLs who, have sort of an infrastructure that they want to develop into. So we're going to see continued opportunities growing from all sorts of smaller businesses.
Thanks. Great. So I think that's all we had. It looks like there are a lot of questions here in the chat, and there are also a lot of notes on additional vendors. So thank you very much.
Thank you for that great presentation. Just following up on that 3PL comment or question, it seems like there's a trade-off. Like you might go for a full service distributor, or you might go for a 3PL. What are the characteristics that would lead a publisher to go one way or the other?
So I think it really depends on who your audience is, like who's the final consumer, and also as a publisher, do you already have a strong sales unit in place, whether it's in-house or external? So what I am seeing more and more is that um, as as we're growing as an industry and in media, we are finding all of these new niche areas, and the distributors really are struggling to find sales reps that can, go into every single one of these niche areas. And so I think if you have a more general trade approach, the larger distributors can be really helpful for you. But if you have really specialty titles, you might want to look at some other options, because again, you want to look for a win-win solution. If you have books that just really aren't a match for a distributor, even if that distributor has great terms and you want to be with them, um, they may not be the best match. And so there's nothing wrong with that. It's just knowing who wants your books, what is the best way to get them there, and how can you do that successfully, and find out the combination that works for you. Um, no two publishing houses are alike, which is really amazing and also incredibly frustrating. So, when it comes to figuring out what the best solution is, you really have to look at your specific list, your customers, and where your sales efforts need to be going.
It seems like with the 3PLs that you would need your own sales force since they don't do that, and likely you would need your own ERP to be able to drive their fulfillment.
Yeah,
Could that be, please?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at this. I think that fundamentally, I think first we need to understand. Miriam touched on this. Like, it might not be either or. It might be both. You might have a line of books that you want to place specifically with a distributor and other business that you leave at a 3PL because that business is being generated by your company on its own. So, I think a lot of publishers have large direct to consumer businesses that don't go through a distributor, but they'll be placed at a 3PL so that they can just hand over those orders and have them shipped. Um, and I think that the order taking process is a big piece of it. I think 3PL, you hand them the order, you say, get the books where they need to be. I think that on a distributor side, it's very much about them soliciting the orders for you and kind of making that money for themselves. They have that motivation to do it. So that's one of the biggest things. And whether or not to switch back and forth, I think it depends on whether or not you want to get wrapped up in an exclusivity arrangement where your books are assigned a vendor of record that everybody else in the industry is going to be trying to get them specifically from that particular vendor of record, and that's what a distributor is. Whereas I think a 3PL can be sort of independent from that.
Amazon is notoriously stringent on availability and information and pricing updates and all of the rest. Do you see them relaxing that at all, or is that going to be a level of discipline that most publishers are going to whoa, be pretty surprised by?
I don't see them relaxing it. I think it's going to be even more critical going forward.
I agree.
So that's certainly something that folks are going to need to pay attention to. In the beginning, we were talking about thinner margins. I don't remember who it was. Somebody asked, what do you attribute the thinner margins to in this business?
Sure.
In other
So,
words, what are the increasing costs? Yeah.
yeah, so a lot of it has to do with a combination of primarily external factors that are raising the cost and expenses of the distributors. And again, the retail price of the books has not been increasing. And so there's less and less wiggle room for the distributors to make to make those revenues. We're also still working in an industry that accepts returns. So, the distributor could actually pay out, and then pay out to the publisher and then potentially get returns later, um, which nobody wants to hear, but then you have to adjust for that. So, again, there's some very antiquated areas of our industry that we're still fighting against. But overall, I mean, just basic things like the cost of power, the cost of water, staffing costs, healthcare costs. So a lot of these things have absolutely nothing to do specifically with books or with publishing, but that's what we're up against. And so, again, publishers wanting to provide more services. So, of course, the distributors provide those services, but then they have to charge more fees for them. So, again, it's a balancing act, and it's just getting more and more complicated as far as what the demands and expectations of the publishers are, and what the distributors can actually provide, especially when
Makes
they're up
sense.
against something like Amazon, which um, none of the publishing companies are ever going to match. That sounds terrible, but I'm just going to put that out as a statement. We're not going to catch up to Amazon. So we have to figure out how we can use what we already have to the best of our abilities to at least navigate around Amazon and do the best that we can independent of that.
So, what are some of the leading indicators that a distributor might be in trouble, or if you don't want to be that specific, the kind of like environmental bumps that are going to cause like financial stress for a large number of them?
Sure. So, I mean, I think we've seen it again with the four companies that we mentioned. They were all up against declining sales and decreasing margins. So again, they could not keep up with the external factors that were hitting it. But again, I think what's really important is again I know a lot of publishers who have been, they want to be very nice and they're a little bit reticent to address issues with their distributors immediately. So a lot of problems can kind of flounder for several months before being addressed. So I absolutely encourage anyone, as soon as you start seeing issues with your distributor, please address them. And also know know some of the other publishers that are working with that same distributor and try and have at least kind of a micro community and see if other people are experiencing the same thing. Um, Obviously, you want to be careful about we don't want to be slandering anybody or causing distress. So, but obviously there were kind of some open rumors about Baker and Taylor before they went down,
for a
and
long time.
so I would just encourage people to kind of keep their ear to the ground, talk to other people, and see what might be happening.
Yeah.
So this might carry on. Sorry.
Yeah, can I just want to say, like, I think that talking to other clients with any distributor, if you're considering that business, is probably essential because you get that feedback directly from somebody who's already working with them. And then to be specific about your question, I mean, there are all sorts of ways you could see things in decline, but I would say a major slowdown in order processing, in shipping, or watching systems get antiquated. Those are usually like pretty good indications because any company is going to take the incoming revenue and assign it to the things that are more crucial for its day-to-day business. And among those things include, paying the clients, paying the staff, the overhead. But some of the things like, upgrading your, royalty software, that might be something that, you put on the back burner while you're focusing on everything else. So there are things I think you can look at and kind of go, I wonder what this means.
Yeah, it seems like some of the credit manager skills of looking for slower payments, like D&B rating, if that's even a thing anymore, um, and like what the general trend of the financials are. Do most distributors share their financials with their customers, or do they pretty much try to avoid that? Oh, sorry, their publisher suppliers.
I'd say I mean, we work in a fairly private industry, so it's not often shared. So
Yeah, so just checking like slow payments and other things would be a good
yeah.
indicator. Um, you mentioned the 6 month transition from
Yeah.
one distributor to another. That's certainly a big disruption. Uh, what kind of costs can a publisher expect during a transition? Presumably, there's some like number you can estimate.
Right. So as far as I would say it's more the non-measurable costs that are going to hit you that are the larger impact. So as far as you might have external costs with physically moving your inventory from one location to another, but it's really um the dip in sales where you get the loss in a sale, you get an order coming into the original distributor, but it actually now needs to be moved to the new to another vendor. So that moving the order is what really gets tricky, or if the new distributor doesn't actually have the books available, stored, identified in their pick room, into their system, etc. So again, it's if you're going to move distributors, take as much time as you can to do the pre-planning and get this, get your logistics in place ahead of time. I mean, moving the physical copies is like the easiest part of it, actually. At this point, there's so much around the data that needs to go into it to make things go smoothly.
And you could even imagine being fully up and running in the new distributor while you're still working in the old distributor so that the cutover happens and you're not out of business for a couple of weeks.
Hello.
Or
I,
yeah.
I think
Hello.
some companies. Oh, sorry, Dave.
Who's this?
uh, David, are you trying to talk to us?
Good. Where's this about, Kevin?
Oh, I think he's on the phone.
Okay,
Um,
carry on.
so I was just going to say that I kind of just lost my points. Um, so the disruption between two distributors, I think that part of the issue too is that any healthy publishing program has a steady stream of new releases coming out, and when you're going to literally be changing the supply chain and you're going to be changing your vendor of record throughout the industry, I think that there is going to be a time where you're going to say, "Hey, I can't release this book in the last 6 months of my relationship with the previous distributor." So you have to like change your production schedule all around, and that creates these gulfs in your revenue just naturally. So that's another big part of it too.
Whenever I had to do something like this, mostly it was 3PL to 3PL or owned to 3PL as opposed to distributor. I always tried to do it in the slack period of like when like returns were coming back and I wasn't planning on doing a lot of shipping. So in the January, February, March timeframe before summer and before seasonal sales in the fall. What are generally the cost categories that often surprise publishers later, after the transition happens?
Ooh, that's a good question. I'd say generally, it usually comes down to kind of the nickel and dime items,
Yeah.
as far as around, um, a lot of publishers don't necessarily see their physical stock. So they may think that their stock is in perfectly good shape and it goes from one distributor to another, and it's not, and it might require some extra cleanup, um, stickering, cartons, etc. So I'd say it's kind of a lot of the little stuff that happens um, in the pick room and around, just kind of cleanup of the stock. Richard, what would you say?
I mean, I think the nickel and diming, that's a huge thing. I think every company says that they may not want to nickel and dime, but I think that accounts do that, and I think that when you're talking distribution is such a narrow margin in the middle that all of these additional costs have to go somewhere, and so all of a sudden the publisher will see them kind of filter through on their statement and be like, hey. But and it's the typical things, like freight and co-op and all of those things. But freight costs alone or may not be something that a publisher is anticipating.
Yeah, with the surcharges and stuff that we're seeing with parcel and LTL carriers, that's a big deal. How long should these deals be for? Presumably, if it's going to take you 6 months, this is not something you want to be doing every other year.
So distribution contracts are usually a minimum of 2 to 3 years.
And should they
And
be longer?
I would be hesitant to go longer. Usually there's kind of a built-in option for renewal up to maybe, 5, 6 years, max without changing terms. um, so that if you're happy with it, you can continue. But also if you're displeased with the service, then you have your out after the 3 years.
I mean,
One,
I personally would say we're presenting here like a panel about, changes in distribution, and it's happening so quickly, and so many things are so sort of huge that if you made a 5-year commitment to somebody, I think that you're going to see a completely different business on the other side of that bracket. So maybe maybe 3 is better. And the reason why you want multiple years is because I believe that publishers and distributors relationships need to have time to gel, a couple seasons one after the other. I think that out in the field, I think that buyers will become familiar with which supplier is offering which publisher after 2 or 3 presentations rather than simply one. So it really just helps overall if you have stay put for a little while.
Yeah, I'd say it
I'm
probably takes about a year, like 6 months to a year, really for the publisher and distributor to get a good relationship established. Same thing like working with a new printer or working with a new designer. It just takes time to understand each other's personalities and how things work.
Yeah.
What sorts of reports would you think would be macro level reports would be the most important things to keep your eye on or to ask for as you're working with a distributor?
Richard?
Oh yeah. I mean, obviously, I think sales is the big one. I think that every publisher should be able to kind of log into some portal every day and see what has sold in the last day's time, or run whatever length of time you need to run it for. If you're doing monthly bookkeeping, whatever, you need to at least have monthly statements. That's the big thing. But like I said in my earlier, presentation, I think that publishers want to know the progress of sales. I think that call reports like, hey, like when was this presented and what was the response to it? I think that's something that our industry has kind of not really kept up with. I think it's tricky, but I think it's something every publishers want to see. And I think that that would help improve value to your distributor immeasurably.
And the financial reports about looking at like time to payment and things like that, probably
That should be on your regular statement, I would think.
Yeah, and
just
then
every day.
also, just inventory levels, and identifying what is selling and what is excess. Just again, looking at that every month, which also, that informs your reprint decisions and your production department. You need to have that data so that you can be scheduling your reprints out 6 months to a year in advance. We should be able to do that once you have a couple years data.
Now I've got some wrap up questions, but it's a little too early for that. So I want to see if anybody else wants to come off of mute and make themselves known. Todd, you had a good point about cash flow and payment terms.
Yeah, I was gonna say I think there's some really good points here in the chat. So if you don't have the chat open, please open it and look at everybody's comments.
Yeah, I definitely agree with the cash flow issue, especially Ken, when you were talking about changing distributors. I think that you have to consider the fact that when you go to a new distributor, even if they can sell you right out of the bat, you won't get paid for it for 4 months essentially.
So that's kind of a giant trough in your
And the previous distributor might take a reserve when you're on the way out because they know that they're going to get a number of returns over the next 6 months. So you're not going to get paid by the new distributor, but you don't get paid by the old one either. So you
yeah.
do have that goal.
Yeah, I might see then negotiating the 2 or 3 year contract, but making sure that I've got an RFP going like right at the end and kind of favoring the incumbent if there's any chance of doing it. Otherwise, you'll end up having that periodic outbound interruption.
Yeah, I think from a distributor perspective, hey, this is Todd. Going out more than 3 years is hard because of all the things that we were talking about earlier with costs and inflation escalating. Unless the distributor has a clause in the contract that says there's going to be an adjustment for inflation, it's hard to commit to a 5-year deal without having those built-in escalators, or having some sort of clause that says if it's going to be based on a publisher's sale price, which a lot of the sales and distribution deals are as a percentage of sales, having something in there that protects against your cost of inflation versus the publisher's cover price costs. Because if the publishers aren't raising prices, and which is hard to do, as we know, you can't just raise a price, 3% every year forever. The margins are just going to continue to shrink for the distributor if it's solely based on a function of cover price less discount. So I've seen some deals where there's actually a calculation that gets done where you compare cover price, suggested retail price of your client versus, a CPI or some other metric. And if it's not keeping up with it, then, costs could go up as well. So there has to be some sort of protection, anything beyond 3 years, I think, for both parties, because it's just impossible to look that far into the future.
Yeah, I've done a few transactional deals, both with printers and 3PLs, where we put in an escalator, but also there's the opportunity for like reevaluation and price negotiation against other players.
Well,
But
the irony there too, I think, is that publishers who are successful with their distributor after 3 years, they're going to ask for their prices to come down. And we're in the face of this inflation and in the face of what we're talking about. So you kind of start then splintering off in these directions where you may not be working, kind of with the same goals in mind. Todd, I think that was really, really great advice.
and making that an explicit part of the expectations on both sides, that yeah, this margin runs off of the percentage of revenue as well as increasing costs, and you don't want your distributor to be going out of business on you, so you need to help them out. So
And
I
the
know
chat.
we've had several clients that they're often kind of at the end of their 3-year period with their distributor. They've been fairly pleased, but then they get terms from another distributor that are much lower. And so it's very tempting for them to change, but then they're not kind of taking into consideration all of these other areas. And so in general, we recommend to publishers that if they are happy with their current distributor, try to negotiate with them and try to find some new terms that'll work better for you instead of going through the shift. It's a huge upset on both sides. And again, you're kind of just reestablishing that positive relationship with your vendor. Again, you might need to switch. Maybe the terms are that much better. But again, really try to work with your existing distributor if you're happy with them, and you're pleased with where you're at. Um,
Changing your vendor sourcing to like can discourage buyers from continuing to support your product. It doesn't necessarily have to happen, but it can. If they've been supporting something for a very long time and suddenly they can't get it from the company they used to, they may use that as an opportunity to find something else.
yeah. So in summary here, what do you expect to look meaningfully different, say a year from now, with respect to distribution?
so I'm hoping that in another year we actually have a few more smaller players that are entering the field. Again, just printers that are offering more solutions, getting that. I think a lot of it is just around marketing, letting people know that they have these services available. And again, just talking to more publishers that are already offering distribution as they expand to other clients. Um, and I expect there to be some more digital companies that are coming into play that are going to be offering services for ebooks and audiobooks. And then we're going to go through another wave of consolidation, and they're all going to disappear, and we're going to have the same conversation in another 2 years.
One of the so I don't know who GAMCM is, but they mentioned maybe another feature of the new distribution offering is some sort of filter on AI slop that they're not going to sign on with a publisher that might be a slop factory, as it were.
Right. So I think there are going to be we have to kind of start defining what is kind of AI slop, but then also what is fraud versus I mean, we have to kind of, there's some different areas that the distributors definitely are coming into play with getting rid of this content before it goes out into the market. But I think we need to be very careful. Maybe there are plenty of people that are buying what others consider to be AI slop. So
Right.
I think we have to be very cautious about what we say is legitimate content and what is not legitimate content. It's just identifying what the content is and where it came from, as far as how we move forward. I think there's more concern about copyright and fraud, and getting revenues for other people's work. Um,
I, I want
I think it's a very enlightened perspective. Richard?
I don't know
Yeah,
what
I just
Richard.
want to say for GAMCM, I want to say specifically that, AI slop or AI can, I mean, it is about copyright. It is about who owns it. And I think that, whereas a distributor has more muscle and can kind of move, more in the industry against a client that is supporting the AI slop. Um, Ultimately, they don't have the copyright. Usually, in a distribution relationship, the copyright does not fall on the distributor, so the distributor can only do so much. They can do so much as an exclusive sort of vendor of that product or of the competing product, but they can't really get in the ring in terms of trying to fight for your copyright. That belongs to the publisher.
So, what is one thing that publishers can do now to make themselves easier and more profitable distribution partner?
I'd say working on data cleanup um, overall, and I think in general, part of what we talked about at IBPA and some other places is that um, we need a huge overhaul on a lot of our websites for generative AI, and that's publishers and distributors.
So it's
So
creating the pull and the wherewithal to allow the pull to happen is the big thing.
right, so the books need to be discoverable for sure, and obviously we need to make sure that the bookstores, that every place that's selling them knows that the book is available.
Yeah, Miriam, wasn't one of the points that came up that like a publisher should now feature like a frequently asked questions on their website because for whatever reason, the AI agents kind of catch those and that can get into the conversation faster?
Right, so so there was a lot of discussion, and I don't want to say anything incorrectly because I am definitely not an AI expert, but essentially our sites need to be rewritten for AI to read them more easily, so that when we're trying to do a search, they can get that data faster. So it's not that they can't get it right now, it's that it is taking them longer to read how we're presenting it. But that's a
Yeah,
whole different presentation and a different lunch and learn. I'm not going to go
that's
there.
right. That's a generative, what is it? Generative engine optimization versus SEO.
Yes.
Um, all right, we're nearing the end of our time here. Any last comments before I thank you for your participation and everybody's questions?
I
Any
had,
final comments?
I had a comment.
Please.
Hi, I'm an AI architect, so the schema behind the metadata is like, you're right, it's very important. And I know it's a whole different lunch and learn, but if you do use an AI service such as ChatGPT, you can go into one of the customized engines and ask it to create the schema for you and have an expert then look it over to see if it's accurate.
That's excellent. And Jane, thank you for the questions. You put a number of great ones into the chat as we were moving along there.
Thank you. Yeah, and I just would just like to, who's doing it right? Who's doing a good job of this?
There are a few of them, some of the larger companies, but yeah, again, a whole other a whole other
Yeah, okay,
discussion.
okay,
So,
okay.
but I actually know some of the some of the really small, like micro presses who have just a couple of people, they've made it a priority to go in and completely redo their websites, and they're actually more on top of it than some of the kind of mid-sized publishers.
Yeah, it's becoming a lot easier. And if there's any technical people, if you can get into Claude skills and do Claude code, you can do a real great job on this.
Yeah.
A guy named Cam Lennon did a great presentation on the US Book Show on GEO and what it means for publishers.
Yeah.
Very nice. All right. Thank you for the great interactive session. Certainly a lot of great information here and very practical and economically meaningful for all publishers. So thank you again. Really a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
it.
Bye.
Brian, any final words?
No, thank you, Ken, for moderating, and Richard and Miriam. It's always good to both see you and work with you. We really appreciate the work that you've done here, and we'll create a video in about a week and distribute it to everybody who's registered as an attendee. We'll also try and figure out a way to share some of the very significant contributions in chat today.
Very good. Have a good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.